My name is Jeremy Mikola, and I'm going to be at a last minute as of 2 weeks ago, and Dennis stepped in with his config bundle talk. I switched from doing bundle pro tips to a brand new topic. So this will hopefully be a slight change of pace. There's going to be no code shown in this whole presentation, so you can take it easy and turn your brains off for a minute and just enjoy some of the amusing slides. And I want to go through, this is maybe more appropriate because we have all the Drupal guys here and the community's definitely growing a lot bigger with Symfony 2 in the States now. But what does it mean to be a good open source contributor? And so we're just going to go through a couple of like recipes or best practices for behavior interacting with the community. Okay. So just as much information about me that I could put in one slide. I've been involved in the Symfony community for, according to this, 3 years. And I'm currently working at 10gen doing anything related to PHP and Mongo. And then also, very happily, part of my job description is to work on Doctrine ODM, which I helped develop previously at OpenSky, and we were using it at Exercise. Both of those were Symfony 2 apps, and going back even years before that, I was using Symfony 1 at IAC. And then along the way, I've collected a bunch of badges. Some of them might not be recognizable. There's the sausage badge from Germany last year, the badge for sending Fabian a postcard. And I'm still waiting for my button for this conference. Okay, so who's using open source software here? Just a show of hands. If you're not, you're probably in the wrong conference. So pretty much, I think we're all using it, and it's more of a question of how much of it are we using. That's me again. Okay, I've got to learn how to do this. Okay, so among us, who's been involved on IRC, like talking with other people in the community, or on the forums? I didn't even know that there were Symfony forums until last year in Paris. And then there's some of us that maybe supported, sent in issues, did bug reports. Definitely, we're probably all on GitHub, at least watching the Symfony repository. And how many people here actually publish bundles of themselves? How many people publish bundles that other people are using? Good. Thank you. And I just want to thank the KNP guys for having the KNP Bundles website, which is, I think we've all used it at some point to find out about, definitely with all the wealth of projects on GitHub, it's really helpful to find out what the actual Symfony bundles that we can use are. So there's definitely no shortage of opportunity that we can get involved with open source. And it's more of a question of what are the different ways that we could help out with. So I kind of pulled this out of my butt. This is 4 different things that I think any open source project needs in some degree. And the first thing is evangelism, and that's going to be getting the word out about the project. And this is something that, even with no technical experience, we could hire marketing people to do this for us. But we don't have a budget, so we're relying on all of ourselves. And then there's going to be getting acquainted with the project, and that's what we're going to be interacting with the documentation for. And particularly in Symfony's case, we don't have a team doing documentation. It's everyone's responsibility to help contribute to that. And then certainly once you rope the users in with nice documentation and evangelism, you need to support their experience with any project. So this is something I do at 10gen makes their Mongo is completely open source, and we make all of our revenue doing commercial support. But the other half of my job is we get tickets come in on Stack Overflow and the mailing lists, and those go into Jira as free support tickets. So I'm doing that for 3 days out of the month. And so that's a huge project of for any project to have good adoption, you want to support the people actually using it. And then ultimately, the project has to go somewhere, so we need development resources. And it's going to take me a while to learn how this works. So the next slide after this. Okay, so let's start with evangelism. And thank the guys at GitHub for get used to seeing these octocats, because I use almost every one available. So when we're looking at new open source projects to use, how do we even find out about these open source projects? So anybody want to comment to that? Whether it's Google, GitHub, how do you guys find out about stuff? Word of mouth? Okay. Twitter? Okay. And then later, how do we decide to actually use these projects? So that's probably also going to be word of mouth. We want either our coworkers are using them, maybe people are experimenting with them on the side, and you're evangelizing within your team because you want to use Symfony 2 instead of Kohana inside your company and get some job skills when you ultimately leave the company that was using Kohana in the first place. And then later, we want to motivate other people to join in and contribute to our framework or our open source project. And then that's definitely, particularly in like Sensio's case, we have Fabian spends his full time. He has Victor also he hired to work full time on Symfony. But mostly it's all of the community and those 500 contributors that are guiding the development of the framework. So we don't have an infinite supply of Lucas Smiths to do all of the evangelism for us. So this is where we're going to have to come chime in, and someone could add this to the list of Lucas Smith being mentioned. Somebody tweeted that he was mentioned too many times at SymfonyLive already. All right, so sharing your experiences are going to be how we reach out to the current users and the prospective users. So whether this is blog posts or if we're doing it in a company context or what we're doing in our freelance projects, it's doing case studies. So we would never know that YouPorn is using Symfony 2 if they didn't present at Confu and do a case study. And it was a fascinating, whatever you think about the company, fascinating to find out how Symfony 2 is being used at such amazing scale. And this is no doubt in the other companies that have presented on how they're using Symfony 2. And the last Paris conference, there was a German weather company, weather.com, and they had just using Symfony 2 and Varnish to completely overhaul the #1 weather site in Germany. It was just fascinating to see. When I like to think the companies I worked for, Symfony 2 was a small project, and maybe it's larger than more independent projects, but when I see it used at these much greater companies that have bigger demands, bigger user bases and things, it's really encouraging and factors into our decision to use frameworks. And then for the actual people working on Symfony, we and they need feedback to actually decide where to go with the framework. Even like the last week after Fabian announced that we had the release cycle, he went on the mailing list, posted an RFC, and wanted to collect comments on how people feel about it. And so this is vital for guiding the decision-making that goes forward. And in the same way, when we decide what new features we want in Symfony 2.2, 2.3, down the line, we want to collect the experience of how people are actually using Symfony. We don't want to make things that people aren't going to use. And then definitely, particularly I think in the case of documentation, when people share their experiences, whether they're complaining or whatnot, it tells us what is working about what we're doing and what needs to change. So good feedback helps guide decision making, with the caveat that sometimes it doesn't, and people make decisions just because they want to. But generally, when we give praise for something, we're reinforcing the positive decisions that get made. And when we give criticism, we're having people reevaluate their decisions. And I promise you, this will be the only life coachy slide in the whole presentation. So when we give our criticism, it's important that criticism is absolutely vital. We're going to make mistakes down the line. We want to correct this. And we want to avoid these positive feedback loops where we're going ahead with features or frameworks and we're thinking, oh, this is great. Everybody needs this. Let's just go forward with this. And you find out after you've already invested the time in it that nobody actually wanted this, but nobody wanted to speak up and said it was useless, or maybe in a nicer way. So we want to be constructive with our criticism. On the same token, if you go and say Symfony sucks for this reason, there's a responsible person on the team is going to pull out some constructive nature of that, even if it didn't come across right. But if we want to, this is about being a good contributor, so I'm going to encourage you all to be constructive when you give criticism, explain why something doesn't work. And that's going to save the time you don't want. If you ultimately want to see the thing that you have a problem with fixed, you want to avoid the problem of the person being insulted and then deciding maybe I'm not going to deal with this comment right now because it's inflammatory, et cetera. So be constructive, and your goal here, if you're doing it the right way, is to actually see progress and change. And so we do that with being constructive. And then any decision that is going to be made about the future of the framework or even the smallest projects, we want objective input. So this is avoiding the positive feedback loop. We don't want to act on our own and thinking what's best for the community without the community actually telling us. And then an important thing that I can't emphasize enough, and this comes up a lot of times with PHP frameworks, can stress you to be an advocate of something, but not to be a fanboy. So we all have negative connotations of fanboys, and we're probably, first thing that comes to mind is people waiting outside the Apple Store for an iPhone. That's not what I'm talking about. More of the people that are going to go on a forum and someone says, oh, I have to use something, I'm using this framework. The first reply is not, well, let's evaluate your decision. How are you using that framework? It's to say, oh, you're using the wrong framework. Go use this. It'll solve all your problems. And this is going to, for one of the, related to this talk, the reason why I think it's a huge problem is because you're forcing a solution on someone that is, if it's ultimately not correct for them, they're going to have a bad experience with it. It's going to ultimately harm the community. And so this person that was cajoled into using Symfony for a project that really didn't need it is going to go tell people, I used Symfony for this and it sucked. And now you're doing the opposite of probably what you intend to happen. So let's not get the forcing frameworks or projects on people before we know exactly what their use cases are. Okay. And if we do this correctly, we're going to be able to grow the community out. And so personally, growing the community is what you're all doing right now. You're attending conferences, you're making friends. And then also, when we go back home, we probably have meetups, user groups that go on. And then Pablo from ServerGo reminded me, as companies, what is their responsibility in evangelism? And a lot of times, this may be controversial. I'm going to say companies are not people. So companies will not be, instead of attending conferences, the company is going to sponsor the conference. They're going to send their employees. So their employees are their fingers into the open source community. And so as a company entity, it's great if the companies end up sponsoring projects in any degree. So this is clearly how Drupal got started. It took up donations. And it's going forward, we have Sensio sponsoring most of Symfony. That's at least 2 full-time developers working on it all the time. So this is something we go back, we take, and our boss says, we're using open source. How could we get more involved? We can't dedicate one of our employees to work on it full-time, but you can sponsor various things in the community. And then what I would pinpoint for evangelism, and then he also ties in later, but Javier Egilis, Egilis? Sorry, okay. I was weighing whether or not to pronounce the last name. So he writes the Weekend Symfony posts, and he's also responsible for the Symfony ES conference. So here was a guy that came along a couple of years ago and decided, I'd like to start covering things in the community. So he started blogging on the Symfony blog. Now every week you go in and there's this nicely written summary of all these other blogs that are talking about Symfony, everything that's going on in each of the Symfony branches, the commits that have been accepted, and then maybe a blurb or two about some special paragraph of like, if you went this week, it'll be describing the event that's going on. So this is an amazing contribution, and taking it one step further, he was in Spain, and he realized there's not a Symfony community here, so let me start something. And now they have a conference on the scale of SymfonyLive in Paris, like 300, 400 people. Fabian goes to every year and presents. Much other great speakers come and present, and now he's essentially steamrolled this entire community where there was none just a couple of years ago. So this is a great example of starting with the most basic things and then just seizing opportunity after opportunity to grow it into something wonderful. So once we've got all these users in and we've done a great marketing job at evangelizing, now we want to document our project so people actually know how to use it properly. So when we pick up a new project, whether it's a framework or download some new software like this stupid Jeopardy thing that was not working yesterday, we have to get up and running. And now Symfony makes this easy with the standard distribution. And a lot of the documentation is written from coming with very little experience with frameworks, much less PHP. So then once we are up and running, how do we learn how to use the project? And then when we're going to start developing with it, we need to look into the APIs and then also what am I thinking here? Just exploring the code base. When you want to become a contributor, you're looking in under the surface that you'd find in the actual manual and go a bit deeper to start contributing to the innards. Okay. So we do not have an infinite supply of Ryan Weavers either. Yes. And there's a myth that only rock stars, they just write the code. The documentation is written by these other guys in the audiences. And maybe the same thing applies we like to think it applies to test cases. So I'm going to write the code, and somebody else beneath me is going to take care of documenting my code for me and then taking care of the test cases because I'm too good for test-driven development. And if we look at the facts, certainly Ryan Reaver is well ahead of everyone else here. But Fabian, who spends the most time contributing to Symfony, is also a huge contributor to documentation. And then this list goes on. It's not as good as it certainly should be because the documentation is constantly neglected, so you can't emphasize this enough. But you have real developers contributing to the documentation. And then this goes beyond if we look at who wrote the actual test cases in Symfony. There's plenty of developers that just spend time filling in gaps of test cases. It's something that came up when we were on the road to 2.0 release. We had the weekly dev meetings, and there were areas where there was just missing test coverage, and we went back and we filled a lot of those in. So the documentation comes in all forms, whether it's from the code, we have the inline comments, and as someone working with Symfony long enough, I tend to ignore the book and go right to the code or the API documentation. And then practically in any project, particularly those that are missing written documentation, the test cases are awesome, if there are even test cases. If there's not, you're probably not in the right project. But that's a huge resource of finding out what the code actually does, even if the documentation might be lying. But when we talk about our users, they mostly need the README file is going to be the first thing they see when they go on GitHub. The book or the manual in some way. A lot of projects have wikis. And then supporting users after they get acquainted with the project, we have these cookbooks and we have these tutorials. So going back 5 years ago, the first framework before I picked up Symfony 1, I got started with Cake. And the thing that drew me to Cake was I went to their homepage. They had a nice logo of a cake. It was illustrated very nicely, and that drew me in. It was a very warm, nice color scheme. And they had an amazing wealth of cookbooks. And that was ultimately what sold me was as good as the Symfony 1 book was, the cookbooks and the community around Cake's tutorials were just, I felt so much stronger at the time. And we've certainly come a long way since then in the Symfony community, but this is, from my personal experience evaluating, it was a complete blank slate working with my first, deciding I'm old enough now I should not be writing my own PHP framework from scratch, so let me use something. And that was the criteria that ultimately sold it for me. And then maybe we look at it as this is actually code, but the starter apps and the distributions are a form of documentation to get people up and running. And when you take the Symfony standard distribution and you get started with it, it walks you through essentially the same manner of documentation of setting up your database connections, setting up your templating, cache directories, and all that stuff. So this is something that certainly needs focus to get people familiar with the project. And when we talk about great written documentation, that's what I'll focus on mainly. You want a consistent writing style. So it's being developed collaboratively, and we have, I think the Symfony documentation project has over 50 people that have committed to it. But ultimately, you want it, when you read a book, you expect it to be written by one author. That's not the case in a software project, but you should expect some consistent uniformity in the writing. And this both goes to the recently I was contributing some patches to Zen Framework. I looked in their contributor guide of whether it was code or documentation, and they enforce exactly like what is the tone of the first person, second person, et cetera, that you should be writing in the style, because you don't want to go on to the next paragraph and all of a sudden it's I do this, and then later it's we, and et cetera. So it's things like that add polish and make it easier to digest this shared living document. And now another problem with documentation as we publish our own bundles, I've certainly done this, I write documentation from my perspective, and the documentation really needs to be written considering who the users are. So as we are all users of Symfony, you are the best input to what the documentation should look like, because you know exactly what's missing. And where someone like Ryan, myself, Hugo would assume that there's some certain knowledge already exists, you know exactly what needs to be discussed, and maybe the order that things are being presented could be more easily digestible in some other fashion. And then a vital thing is that the documentation needs to, it's a living document, it needs to be kept in sync with the code. So wrong documentation is incredibly dangerous, and I'd say it's worse than the code not working. So if their documentation is telling you to do one thing and you're trusting it, and you actually start running your project and there's syntax errors or, God forbid, even worse, there is no error, but just something does not perform correctly, the function doesn't return exactly what you think it does, it could have devastating consequences. And you're probably trusting the documentation, so you're not going to catch this. So how much lost time is this going to have for you? And on the same token, we need to make sure that our writing proficiency with the documentation is correct. So we would not submit source code with syntax errors. So why are we writing documentation with grammatical errors? Things like that. And that's not to say that you have to be a perfect writer, because probably none of us are. We're software developers here. But you don't have to be a perfect writer to contribute to documentation. But by just doing peer reviews, and then someone is going to proofread your content before they accept a pull request, or just go in and the same way we refactor code, we rewrite bits of documentation to flow better, things like that. So responsibility will start with documentation. It's going to carry over when we talk about code later. We want to follow the existing conventions. So the same way that there are coding conventions, we have style conventions for documentation. So for Symfony, it's like how to format your code examples, how to put notes into your, so you have like little note blocks with a helpful little light bulb icon and stuff like that. And then by all means, no matter what we're committing, we should be willing to test our stuff before we expect other people to do it. And then I think in terms of documentation, this falls into three things. We have the syntax, we have the content of what we're actually, at least spell check what you're writing, make sure that your links work. And then an important thing is preview, particularly when you're dealing with like restructured text or the way the Symfony book is generated. It has to be actually built to see that the results are the same. So for the Mongo PHP driver, I've had to delve into the scary world of PHP.NET documentation, which is a horrible thing that I don't wish on anyone. And it's a doc book with XML documentation for everything. It's an absolute nightmare to get through. And I would have made horrible mistakes just committing an SVN if I had not actually built the PHP docs locally and saw that my formatting was completely off. So in the same way, the Symfony documentation already tells you how to get up and running with Sphinx. So that's great to do before if you're not doing like a quick fork and edit change where you're just changing like a typo or something and you're actually adding sections. Definitely helpful to build the documentation and see what it looks like. And then for many of us that aren't great writers, many of us also are not great English speakers or English writers in any combination. There's incredible opportunity for translation. And the Symfony manual alone has over 10 translations. I'm sure not all of them are as in sync with the canonical English documentation. But this is a huge thing that also ties into evangelism. So when Javier was translating the documentation over to Spanish, that was essential. And we can count even the Symfony, Dustin was just telling me a couple of minutes ago, the community in Japan exists because one guy translated the Symfony manual into Japanese. Now it's quite a large community over there, and they have running their own conferences, and more Japanese developers got roped into this because they now had local documentation and they can pick up the project. So this is, again, the same way if you're not great writers and you can rely on other people to edit your code, you can also, if you're capable of reading English, which probably most of us are just working with source code, we could probably translate into our local languages. And so now we've evangelized enough to get people interested in the project. We've educated them how to use it, and now they're inevitably going to have problems down the line using it. So how do we support all these users? And now users are going to be expecting everything to work all the time, which is completely unreasonable, but there's nothing we can do about that. So you have some users that are just going to ask you, why doesn't this work? If they're nice, they're going to file a bug report and describe the problem that they're having because they'd like to see it fixed. They don't just want to complain. And the really great users are going to make some attempt to fix this, or at the very least, maybe submit a bad test case. So we do not have an infinite supply of stuffs. So if you look at why this guy is important, you saw his photo yesterday in Larry's presentation. Him and Lucas are probably responsible for educating Larry all about Symfony and making the conversion there. So Staff is 34th among the 500 most active accounts on GitHub. And this is right behind TravisBot, which is not a real person. So this is drawn incredibly... There's definitely some doubt over if Staff is just one person or not. But he is, I think we would all agree, if you've worked in Symfony's repository, he's probably, how many people have had a pull request reviewed by Staff? Okay. And how many people have submitted pull requests at all? So he's touched most of our lives in a personal way. I think I've caught him reviewing some of Fabian's commits as well. But he's only one person, and God forbid he gets hit by a bus, we can't let the support train stop. We have to keep moving. So this is really a thankless job. You're going to have plenty of users. For every good user that says thank you, there's probably more that we're going to ask you a question, expect the answer, and just move on with their lives because they're really not polite. We can't do anything about these users. But at the same time, we need to answer these questions. It's going to reflect badly on the project and the community if we are not both fostering the growth and then just welcoming people and making sure that they're not using the project incorrectly. So it's necessary for us to move forward. And then as we continue development of the project, unless it's a stale project, it's completely stable, which I think we can only say for very few Unix utilities like cat and ls and grep and things like that. Support is never going to be finished, and there's going to be more bugs down the line, more questions as people find new ways to develop projects, particularly with a web framework, because the train of HTML5, 6, 7, CSS, and all that stuff never stops, and we'll be writing JavaScript and more languages down the line. So there's going to be this unending flow of people asking us questions. And I think the first thing, this is something I experienced firsthand at Tengen doing support duty a couple days a week, is collect as much information as possible. So find out why the user is asking this question. Because plenty of times they're using the framework badly or using the product badly, or they saw a snippet of documentation, they thought that's what they need to do, and so they're walking down that line, and it's really just the wrong way to use the utensil. Like if they're trying to cut with the fork and stab the steak with a knife, that's probably not the most efficient way, and they're going to have questions. So we want to educate them and explain at the very first, before we make assumptions about what they're doing wrong, collect information, do reconnaissance, and then try to get them to reevaluate what are you actually asking, what are you trying to do, before they come across with a bug and they say, I need this specific thing fixed. And if it's at all possible, it's to the benefit of everyone that we can refer to existing content. So this hard to do on IRC, but if definitely on Stack Overflow and on Google Groups, mailing lists, and things like that, if there was the same question was asked a week ago, a month ago, a year ago, and the answer is similar, even if the answer might have changed a little bit, refer back to the old question. It's going to provide more context, and maybe that will answer part of the question or all their question that they had. And additionally, we're avoiding creating duplicate answers that may or may not be correct. So if we can have a canonical answer for this question that comes up all the time, that's to everyone's benefit. We're going to have more links to that question. That's certainly on Stack Overflow. When you search Google for a question, you're finding things that have surfaced at the top because we have a good exchange and we have a good answer and a good question. We want to vote this up or get it to rank higher in Google so that more people find it, and then it saves everyone time down the line. At the same time, if we can point to existing documentation to answer their questions, all the better. Documentation is doing its job, and the user just didn't find that on their own. So we're just pointing them in the right direction. If there isn't documentation for it, and it's a common question, that's all right. That's some place in the documentation that we need to address. So even that is good. And that's not to say that every question is going to warrant its inclusion in the documentation, but there's going to be certain things that stand out that I'm answering this question, 4 users this month have already had this question. This probably needs to go in the documentation, or at least FAQs and have some random miscellaneous thing that we can refer to. Okay, bug reports. So once after users are asking questions, if the answer is not able to solve their question and they're actually trying to do something reasonable, then it's probably going to be a bug report. And so if we're supporting these users, we want to encourage them to become comfortable with submitting bug reports, even if this means using a horrible piece of software like Jira. And now for security vulnerabilities, there's going to be, particularly if you're using a web framework, or something like a database, you want to have some way for users to report those responsibly. So Symfony has that. Email Sensio Labs with some reproducible steps, and they'll address a security vulnerability responsibly. Preferably, that's not something you don't want to have a big exploit just show up in GitHub like it's happened in recent frameworks within the last couple of years. So get users to report the actual issues, and now once the issues are in there, and they're certainly be of varying quality, part of the job that Stoff does quite well is triaging. So he's weeding out, this is a duplicate issue. He's going to post to the other GitHub issue that it's related to. Or this is actually not a bug, and I'm going to tell you why, and someone else will come along and close the issue. In the same token, we have, particularly in Symfony 2, when we have bundles, and I'll use Doctrine MongoDB bundle as an example. If someone comes in with a bug for Doctrine MongoDB bundle, it could either be Symfony 2's fault, the bundle's fault, it could be Bernard's fault because forms aren't working as they should, or it could be a problem with MongoDB, or it could be a problem with Doctrine or the PHP driver or the Doctrine MongoDB abstraction layer. So this is someone's coming in and I'm using the bundle. The bundle doesn't work, so I'm putting the bug report in the bundle. That bug report might actually need to exist somewhere else. Plenty of times I've created bug reports either on the Mongo driver or on Doctrine MongoDB because someone came into the bundle and I was like, I realize you're using this with Symfony. It's actually nothing related to Symfony. It's just the Doctrine doesn't work because John Wage and I are the only ones maintaining it, and we're both very busy. So that's, even if, I guess sometimes I think that's really not contributing. I'm just creating more link clutter and things, but it's, in the long and short, it's helping triage. One, the person is learning to actually identify where the problem is. And then when I go back later, when I actually have time to look into the bug, I'm going to come across this and know that this is waiting on this driver bug to be closed, and then I could squash everything down once the actual problem is fixed. So that's incredibly useful and turns our issue thing into a random pile of random bug reports that we can't make sense of into a related structure of things depending on other bugs. And now, lastly, when there's bug reports coming in, they're going to be incomplete. So there's different gaps that we could fill in. So definitely one of the educational things that you can contribute with is writing test cases there's plenty of people that, even in the last week, someone was talking to IRC about doctrine, and he's like, it would be helpful if you submitted a failing test case. I don't know how to write a test case. I'm very afraid of that, and I don't know how to do that. So someone else can come along and parse his 3 paragraphs of what's broken and come in with a test case. And then as a developer, I come in and I step in, and seeing a failing test case is much easier than sorting out, again, in those 3 paragraphs and trying to figure out what the user was actually trying to do, rather than look at code. And then certainly in the terms of reconnaissance, with finding out more information about these bug reports, we want to collect as much background information as possible. So I recently filed a Symfony bug, and it was about some problem with the internationalization library. And one of the community guys that had worked on that for Symfony 2 came back and he's like, can you dump out what is your PHP extension information and all this stuff, what is your operating system? And he narrowed it down to, Jacob knows exactly what I'm talking about. Yeah, some PHP 5.4 issue with the ICU library. So collecting that background information, and that's helping him make a decision that this is actually not a Symfony problem, it's a PHP problem, but we can work around it and take care of it that way. So, and this is, again, requires no development experience. You're just coming to a bug report, and if you think something is missing, there's a comment button there for a reason. You don't have to have any access rights to the repository. You could just go do this, drive by on anyone's repositories, and just go look on GitHub for open issues, and then just start asking people for more information so that when the actual developer gets in there doesn't have to be that back and forth exchange. And now, most importantly, when people are waiting for bug reports to be fixed, if there's a way that we can have a workaround and they can not have their project roadblocked, it'd be great if you can share that. And a lot of times, I think this also comes in when we report bugs, we come up with other solutions. When we file a bug report, it's not just between us and the developer. There's other people seeing the bug reports. There's and utilities like Jira, you can actually vote up if you're also having the same bug report. When in GitHub, it's kind of hard. You don't exactly know who's watching it. You can see who's commenting and things like that. But if you come up with a solution in the meantime, even if it's something that you put in your local fork of Symfony, this is something we did all the time at OpenSky, using it well before the 2.0 release. Document the workarounds so that other people can also not be roadblocked. It's going to be beneficial to the community. Maybe that will turn into a solution. It could just be a hacky fix. But in either case, it's sharing some way around the problem instead of everybody stop work, we can't move ahead because the security component isn't working. And now after bug reports come in, we're also going to have those great users that are submitting patches, and these need to be code reviewed. And again, staff can't do all this work. So we want to, the dual purpose here is to talk about both as you are submitting code reviews and then as you're reviewing other people's code. So the first thing, whether it's someone else, and TravisBot does this for everybody, but now before I even submit a pull request, make sure the test suite passes. And this is the same rule that we have for documentation. Preview what the actual work looks like. At least even just compile. I've personally used the fork and edit button on GitHub and submitted things that had syntax errors in them. And that was completely my mistake for trusting that I should not have to compile the code for a one-line fix. So it happens even with the smallest of things. So really, any change should require you to make sure that the test suite actually runs. And then if you're fixing bugs, what's to say that the bug is not going to come up again if you don't add a regression test for it? So if it's something that eluded the test coverage, because very few projects have perfect test coverage, we should be adding more test cases to our project as we fix bugs. And then this single bullet in the middle, which, how many people are familiar with object calisthenics? Okay. So this is something that you can certainly Google and read it up. But Guillermo Blanco, one of the Doctrine ORM guys, did a lightning talk on this at SymfonyLive Paris. And it's essentially the same way we have calisthenics for exercises of keeping yourself in shape. This is just general guidelines for pumping out decent-looking open source code. Object-oriented code. And then I have to say, these are completely helpful principles, but don't go overboard with them because some of the rules are like you don't have if statements nested more than once or more than 2 levels deep, which is completely impossible in some cases. But in general, if you can implement some of these in your code, you're going to have better-looking object-oriented code because there's plenty of ways to make a test case pass, but there's relatively fewer ways to do so beautifully. and have it be maintainable code in the future. So, and then there's, any project is going to have its own coding conventions, the same way we have how to write the documentation, we have how to write the code. And now, thankfully, it's going to be more convenient because we have those later PSRs where you have Zen Framework and Symfony 2 now have reasonably similar syntax formatting. And so we have a great utility for this is PHP Code Sniffer, which is in pair. Good luck installing that without Composer. And there's the first link there, the slides will be published later, but that is a profile for PHP Code Sniffer that implements the PSR spec. So that's helpful to run if you don't want to wait for staff to tell you that you indented something badly. You can, or your IDE, you're working in your company project, they have different coding standards. You could run this on your code before you submit a pull request. And Fabian made a separate utility that works in the same lines, and this actually changes the code for you to match the PSR style, which I have not used, but I trust that it is well tested and operational, and Jordy has given me a thumbs up, which is excellent. Okay. So on the case of not arguing with TravisBot, so this was a gentleman that was just submitting a small documentation change, and the test suite was failing. So don't get into arguments with robots, and in general, understand as a contributor what TravisBot does. And in this case, the test suite should not have already been failing. But we want to make sure that we are just, I really have nothing to describe it. I just thought it was a funny slide. Okay. So as we're supporting our users, if we can teach more people to do the same things that we're doing, if we can find a way to clone stuff reliably, like Dolly the sheep, then by all means that's going to make our community a better place. And we could keep up with this demand of all these users coming in and asking all these questions as development progresses. And so as Fabian shared the release plan for Symfony down the line, support is going to be a huge part of it. So these, I'm slightly colorblind, but I think the green is the larger one here. So this is, when we look at the upcoming Symfony releases, the time that we're going to be spending supporting these releases, not even counting the long-term releases, is going to be order of magnitude larger than the amount of time spent developing them. So this is all the period that we're going to have to be responding to questions, maintaining documentation, facilitating patches and pull requests. So it's something we definitely need to focus on. And then apart from just supporting with our time, this was something that came up a year ago. We took up Fabian took up a collection to hire for a professional security audit for Symfony, and we collected enough that we were able to do it for Doctrine and Twig as well. And so this is, I wasn't sure where to actually put this slide because I'm not trying to say like go dump all your money on open source projects and things, but this is the community coming together and for the benefit of these projects down the line, particularly nobody wants to use a framework that has security vulnerabilities or things like that. So, and particularly when you don't have a company completely sponsoring a project, there's times where you're going to have to get people to chip in, and whether it's pay for Drupal servers or pay for a security audit or help out other people in the community, like Chris Walsmith in the past couple months. So this is us coming together both with time and sometimes financially. And so then that brings us lastly to the fourth quadrant of what an open source project needs, and this is we need some way to go forward with development so that people are still using our project down the line, unless we reach that point where we've done all we ever need to do and we're completely stable. But I don't see that happening anytime soon for certainly the Symfony projects if Fabian has releases planned out into 2018. So we don't have an infinite supply of Fabians, and this is not a doctored photo. So thankfully, Symfony 2 we have over 500 contributors today. This is as of yesterday. And this is certainly where we have gotten today would not be possible without everyone, even from the smallest contributions to larger ones, chipping in. So there would be no forms component without Bernard. And there would be certainly no security would not look, you could say this is a plus or a minus, but security would not look like it does today without Johannes spending the time into it. So the first step in any open source project, before even talking about contribution, we look at how open source projects start. And I just reviewing a couple cases and I'll start with Symfony. Fabian was making a lingerie website in France, and he needed a way to do this. He needed a framework for himself, and he adapted, was it Ahave, into Symfony. And this, at the time, he was the Symfony's one and only user, so there was no need for support or documentation. But this eventually grew out, and now we have conferences because somebody had this one need, and someone came up with a solution for it, and it slowly snowballed. So how many core developers got their start by fixing small bugs? So when I joined OpenSky, and Symfony 2 was incredibly young, and there was no forms component yet, and we were weighing building our own, which thankfully we didn't do. The very first patches I submitted to Symfony were just small bugs and small issues that were being reported well before many of the bigger features existed. So the first step of getting involved is just look for that low-hanging fruit to chip in. And so we need, before we do any contribution, there has to be some level of finding out what is actually, how we can actually contribute. And this applies to all three categories: support, documentation, certainly. But I find like going into looking like what the available issues are that need to be checked, you can probably find some easy things that you know you can easily fix, and that someone's reported it, and you have slightly more knowledge than the person that reported the bug. And now that's your inroad to making larger contributions down the line. And so before we start tackling the major contributions, we should find out what's actually needed, because we don't want to implement things that, again, this is a part of having the positive feedback loop. If we're just asking ourselves, this feature needs to be in the framework because I need it. But does it look the same way that other people are going to need to use it? So we want to participate in some group activities to solicit feedback from other people using the project. And particularly on the road to Symfony 2.0, we had weekly IRC developer meetings that Lucas ran for the longest of time. And Fabian would spend an hour of his week come into IRC with the common people, and we'd walk through what are the tasks for Symfony 2 this week. This is one of the earlier memories I have was when the configuration component was coming out, and it was just being built, and we needed to actually adapt it into each of the bundles. And beforehand, all the bundles just did a recursive array merge, and you can imagine the problems and weird behaviors that had. So this was breaking up into task, and it was who wants to take this bundle, who wants to take security bundle and implement config component into that. So these are those don't happen anymore out of necessity because there's just now we could use GitHub issues for most of the collaboration, but as needed, we'll have more roadmap meetings down the discussion. So it's like sitting in the Symfony dev channel. I'd like to say it's not a place to go because everyone's ignoring you in Pound Symfony, so go in Symfony Dev because those are where the people have the answers. But going into the Symfony Dev channel, and that's the best place when Larry wanted to find out how Symfony works and go and talk about what features need to be implemented down the line, that is the best place to talk about things, or on the mailing list and participate in RFCs and things like that. Because if we're going to be contributing responsibly, we don't want to do work that isn't useful. So find out what the needs are and then set about addressing it. Okay. And so this is the resource watcher component was something that the easiest way to explain it, for something like ascetic assets, we'd like some way to hook into libnotify on your operating system, find out when files change, and then ascetic can rebuild the assets. And this was an idea that goes back 2 years that probably could have been in Symfony 2.0 if it was ready and there was a need for it. So we look at what the original pull request was. It was in the 300s, and now we're up to over 4,000. So this sat for a while. It went through at least 3 different pull request iterations of revision. And this was it's a component, so it's the largest bit of code that we could actually put into Symfony. We look at how long it actually took to make this. So there obviously, like Constantine had to be very patient going about with this, especially the back and forth. If you dig up these pull requests, tons and tons of code review going back and forth. So this is just an example of how long it could take to get those big contributions in. And if we go back and look at what it originally would have done and what is finally going to be merged into 2.2, I'm sure there's a lot of differences. So this is just, certainly most of us will never write anything this big and submit it to Symfony. But plenty of us will do. Another thing that comes to mind that's been dragging on was for the console component to get some way to have a progress bar that uses the same line of output. And this is one of the developers in North Carolina has been working on this, and it didn't make the cut for 2.1, so it's still lingering as a pull request, and eventually it will one day get in. Enough people have said it's a useful feature. but it's not. You can't just submit something and expect it to be merged immediately. So the bigger things are going to take time. And so while we're doing this, in addition to patience, we have to approach it with a sense of humility. And so we don't want this to be a butting of too many rock stars in a room and we're all butting heads because we have egos. Plenty of other articles have been written about the open source community, and the hacker culture in general is an egoless atmosphere where you're judged and valued based on the quality of your contributions and not your arrogance or your sense of self-importance. So particularly when we are contributing to other people's projects, we're not the maintainer of that project. As much as we may like to believe, we don't have the authority or the perfect direction of where that project should go. So certainly if there is such a significant disagreement, then that's why the fork button exists. And the fork button is not just for submitting a pull request back to that project. In the old days of original open source, forking was when you took a project and you went in another direction with it. It was a literal fork in the road. And so that was something that really I don't think happens anymore. We see these repositories and we just want to hop in and we collaborate on the development of them, which is great because it brings more people on the same project. But there are points where you're going to have disagreements, and that's a perfectly valid reason to maintain your own patch against Symfony, maintain your own branch when you fork your Symfony repository because your company needs a specific feature, or some hacky doctrine solution because I don't have time to fix the MongoDB. I'm very sorry, you guys. So yeah, fork it and keep it in your local repository, and then at some point when the things are fixed or your contribution gets merged, so you should never be waiting for Fabian to merge your commit into Symfony because you need some feature on your project. And maybe this goes against if you're using Composer and you're pulling in the Symfony repository with your deployments, this requires a different way of thinking. But before Symfony was 2.0 and OpenSky had a fork of Symfony, our branch was at least 7 to 20 commits on top of whatever was currently in master because we couldn't wait for certain things to be merged down. So when we do contribute things, ask who are we actually writing this for? And if we're only writing it for ourselves, we probably shouldn't be committing it. You want to ask the question of how are other people that are using Symfony going to use this? Am I just writing this for my company's very specific need, or am I writing this in a way that other people can extend it and adapt it to their own needs? Because not everybody has the same business requirements as we do. And on the same token, before I expect somebody else to review my work, before I'm going to make Stoff sacrifice his evening of whatever he does in his spare time, I have no idea, I should be willing to at least put in the time to review my own work. So, and this goes with like not submitting something with typos or syntax errors, not being a hasty contributor. Because when we make hasty pull requests, and then that's, say we're submitting a pull request and that we're contributing to fix some bug, and that is 3 units of goodness or usefulness back to the Symfony project. And now that pull request is going to have to go with 3 back and forths because I didn't provide a test case and there were syntax errors. So that goes back, and now I'm down to 1 unit of goodness because I took 2 units of effort away from Stoff and Fabian and the rest of the team. And then that also comes back, the changes I make, then they don't have the right formatting. So go back, that's another back and forth, and now I'm taking up more people's time. In the end, I took 4 or 5 units of effort away from the Symfony core team because I was submitting pull requests that just weren't properly reviewed. So the documentation has plenty of guidelines of what a pull request should look like. And I'm certainly guilty of this. The documentation of having that checklist at the top of the file, I've submitted a couple of pull requests that I thought were truly enough, so I don't really need the checklist. But it's a very simple checklist of like, do your test pass? Does this introduce backwards compatibility breaks, et cetera? And having that there even for the smallest of pull requests is very useful when someone comes around and when Fabian's having his morning coffee and he has to go through GitHub and look at all the new issues, if he could just scan through all the issues in different Chrome tabs and then see, okay, at a glance, the test pass, I see the Travis bot there. There is no BC breaks. Oh, there is BC breaks. Okay, I could just easily resolve this and target it for 2.2 or 2.3, et cetera. So having, just following those guidelines are not there to annoy you, or, I mean, they're really there to make, any large-scale project needs some process in place. So we all have workflows for tickets at our companies on how we collaborate with our coworkers. So in the same way, the open source projects have their, certainly suited to the needs of the maintenance team of how best to triage and work through all the contributions that come in. And then lastly, and this goes with the humility aspect and then knowing when to fork the pull request is not a place to have a religious debate over your framework needs this feature because I need this feature, and I will not accept no for an answer. And then this, certainly GitHub seems to bring out a lot of, maybe not in the PHP community, but I've seen plenty of like Ruby projects where the pull request has devolved into a sequence of image macros, which I personally find amusing. But if I was on the receiving end of that, or if that was my project, I probably would not like that. So maybe I shouldn't be laughing at it. But understand that you are not the controller of the project. You're not the maintainer. And there's probably other motivations there that you're not considering when you're thinking that this absolutely needs this feature because I'm using it and I am dictating the needs of this project that thousands of people are using because I'm important. So there's no small contributors. There's just small change sets. So any contribution you can make, every one of those 552 people listed on Symfony.com as a contributor is equally important and has played a equal role in the success of Symfony, even if they're from the smallest contribution. That if they hadn't made that change, then maybe that bug would still be there, or someone else would have caught it later down the line. So the fact that you're even making a contribution, whether it's documentation or whatnot, is important. And I can't think of anyone better to single out for this than Pascal Borelli. And he is, I believe he's French. He lives in Morocco. And his qualifications are, in my sense, impeccable. He's the CEO of his own life and also a CTO. So he's a very busy man. He's also co-founded a young son. So he's been involved in the Symfony community for a while. He doesn't like to have photos of himself. He likes to take pictures of other people. It's not as creepy as it sounds. We have the best footage of Symfony karaoke because Pascal was there with his video camera. And recently, I don't know when Pascal picked up this fetish, but he goes around on GitHub projects and fixes typos. And this is the White House Gov repository, which is a Drupal 7 project. And this was within 2 hours of the White House open sourcing the petitions.whitehouse.gov website. Pascal comes in with no less than 7 different commits fixing these typos. And some of these are really embarrassing, like in Zen Framework, he replaced the break statement, which should have been a syntax error, but it really wasn't even reachable. So I'll just let this linger for a while. And that was a while ago. So then Pascal shared this with me because I don't know how he found this because I have no idea who's actually using app.net. But this guy was, as far as I know, he has no relation to Pascal, and he was just sharing on app.net about how this guy came along and he fixed his typo in my project. And there's probably, I don't know, just a handful of people using this guy's projects, because Pascal is committed on people's projects that have less than like 5 or 3 watchers. I don't know how he finds this stuff. It's the same thing. How does Staff find your pull requests? And 3 minutes before you actually opened it, he opens it for you with your own code in it. So this guy is expressing his thanks. He probably doesn't know who to thank because where do you find Pascal? He's just this force that comes in and fixes your typos. And this guy, his response, I think, was perfect. He says, this is the complete benefit of open source. So you're putting code out there, and you go to bed, and then somebody comes along, and they submit a pull request while you're sleeping, and now bugs are being fixed magically by these elves while you're sleeping. And this is the wonder of open source. So, and then the important thing is, Pascal did not discriminate what projects he went and decided to contribute to. He contributed to Symfony plenty of times, and I think he'd identify himself as a Symfony developer, but he went and he contributed to Zen Framework. He went and contributed to these other projects that some of them aren't even PHP projects. He actually fixed typos in Benjamin Eberle's blog, because that's a Git repository. So it's important that we don't create borders when there aren't any. So GitHub, if there's a public project and you come across something in your travels and it's wrong, there's a fork button there or a fork and edit button. You could just easily fix it without even using a command line. And I know I said not to use fork and edit before, but you could make an allowance if you think it's safe. So the only case where I say this would apply is if it's Zen Framework 1 and there's a CLA and you don't want to sign a CLA, or it's the Facebook PHP SDK and there's a CLA and you don't want to sign a CLA. So you'll recruit all your friends on Twitter to go bomb the issue feed and get them to accept the composer.json file anyway. We could all thank Lucas for that. So a great example of this, I think, is when Fabian created quite a stir and he committed to Zen Framework 2. This made a lot of people shaky. They were like, oh, is Symfony 2.1 is going to be abandoned now because he's... so this is just, I don't know what the context was, but he came across, he saw something broken and he fixed it. I don't want to think about why Fabian was using Zen Framework 2. but the results of it were certainly beneficial for all parties involved. And it helps counteract any attitude when people say, "Oh, you're just a Symfony guy, and you don't care about any other communities." This is completely the actions are testifying to the opposite of it. So, and then when we have this collaboration, it leads to wonderful things. And you're probably thinking, how did he find a picture of a octocat giving a flower to a Drupal? I have no idea, but somebody decided to make this and share this on GitHub, so I used it. So when we collaborate and we tear down these borders, it allows us to create these new relationships, and all of a sudden we're going from 500 contributors today to down the line maybe 5,000 contributors. And so the important thing is that there's going to be new islands and places in the distance where we want to go with development process, and so we can't give up the building process. And whether that's growing the community with evangelism and just welcoming the new users coming in, and also paving the way for the development roadmap all the way down to 2018, where most of us probably, maybe PHP won't even exist then, but there will be a Symfony release in some language. And so this is a tweet that Pablo retweeted. It popped up in my feed this morning, and I rushed to get it in at the last minute. So Jacobo is a Italian Scrum TDD fanatic. He's presented at a couple Symfony conferences before, and he's, needless to say, extremely excited about working in open source. And I think this tweet perfectly sums up the, just the excitement and the opportunity that presents itself to receive. So we all have different things in our personal lives that we find fulfilling, but to be able to do some of my working time that I have to do to feed myself and to get involved in a community that is also personally fulfilling, not just doing something to make my boss more money, is just an incredible opportunity that we could all be thankful for in some way. And then certainly being here and being able to go out with karaoke with people that I would otherwise have no business, I would have no other business to come to San Francisco than for a conference or to interact. There's those extra side benefits in addition to writing code and be able to make a living off of this collaboratively developed framework. You have the opportunity to get involved in a community and give people hugs, like Larry. There we go. And then shake hands with people, go out to karaoke, make fools of yourself, wind up on YouTube, wake up in the morning and wonder who posted that. So I just want to thank you for sitting through this and for allowing me to not talk about code for an hour. There is a joined-in link. Thank you.